Yeah, I've got a message saying we're streaming live on Facebook.
Okay, I don't quite have that yet. Let's see. Meeting is now streaming live on Facebook. Bill Bullard. Or should I say Yosemite? Are we good?
We're good to go.
All right. All right. Hopefully, let me just log on to Facebook here. Let me just make sure that indeed we are live. So sorry, y'all, about all of this technical difficulty. We had, let's make sure that we're on here. If one of our staff could send us a message. Woo! All right, we are live. Awesome. We'll get back. Okay. All right, Bill Bullard. What a Friday, huh?
Yeah, what a Friday.
What a Friday. What a Friday. My name is Tatum Lee, and I'm your RCAF Development Director, and I am with Bill Bullard, and we are so, I have to find more of my cameras. We are so happy to be with you this evening. I'm so sorry that we're late. We had some technical difficulty, and so, but we are here, and we're very excited to talk to you this evening about some really pressing issues that you're messaging us about. And so we're going to start with this, Bill. Did you watch the cattle market in crisis on the WNAX?
I did, and that was very interesting. I beg your pardon?
I'm sorry, the radio program.
Yes, listen to the radio program, and I would urge everyone to do the same. They had Senator Grassley was on that call, as well as two members of the NCBA's marketing committee. And they talked about what was wrong with the industry and what needed to be done in order to correct the serious problems within the industry. And there was a discussion on, well, do we need to require packers to purchase a certain percentage in the marketplace? And both of the NCBA representatives agreed. And they also both agreed that it needed to be around 50%, which is not at all surprising to us. You know, the NCBA and other organizations have resisted the market reforms that we have been proposing for a long time, but never before have we gotten into the serious crisis that we're in today in our industry. We've described it before as piling a crisis upon a crisis. And so now the entire industry can't help but acknowledge and understand that this marketplace is fundamentally broken. And we have to make some structural changes. And we're very glad to see that the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, I don't know that they've officially adopted this as their position, but they're saying now that it looks to them like the marketplace has to go to at least around 50%. Now the Nebraska Cattleman has already come out and said that. And so now what you have is you have RCAF that has been at 50% for a long time. And you've got the Nebraska Cattlemen at 50%. And then you've got the NCBA talking seriously about 50%. And that means the low ball bid to assist the cattle industry is now the 30% bid, which is far too low. So that's what we're dealing with. And there was an acknowledgement on this call that this is probably the best time ever to get some serious reforms initiated. In fact, one of the speakers said they need to be bold. And then Senator Grassley indicated a clear understanding of the broken market structure. And he was asked specifically whether or not he would introduce legislation in order to require a higher percentage of purchases by the packers in the marketplace. And his response was that he was very interested in doing that. They've been looking at that. He's introduced it before, and that he was somewhat hopeful that perhaps the Packers and Stockyards division could do something within the Packers and Stockyards Act that might not necessitate legislation. I don't know what that would be, but clearly the senator understood there was a problem, and he indicated that he was very interested in working with the industry to solve it. So that program put on by WNAX was extremely informative and I think, you know, very factual. I mean, this was, the industry is beginning to come together on the need to make substantial reforms so U.S. cattle producers can become profitable once again.
Man, let's just say that again. Isn't that so? It's a blessing to be able to get together with NCBA on an issue for the good of the industry right now, because people are bleeding, Bill. And, you know, there have been, well, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but you know, people are bleeding right now, and I'm so thankful. Talk a little bit about the background of Grassley's bill in 2013 and why that's significant.
Well, his bill was actually introduced back in 2007, which is quite some time ago. But there was no one in the industry, without us as the exception, that understood that our industry was headed towards a crash. We've known this for years. And in the last several years, beginning in 2015, we were absolutely convinced that a crisis was imminent in our industry unless we took aggressive, immediate action to reverse it. And that's why in 2016, we called for an investigation by the US Senate Judiciary Committee. Mm-hmm. It's why then later in 2018, we called for an investigation of our cattle futures market. And then in the early 2019, we filed the historical class action antitrust lawsuit against the big four packers. And then in the fall of 2019, we sat down with poultry producers, hog producers, dairy producers, and worked for several months to come up with a comprehensive plan that would indeed reverse the trajectory of the US livestock industries and prevent the impending crisis that we knew would occur. Mm-hmm. And that was RCAF's opportunity to take approximately 20 years of marketplace reforms that we knew were essential and put them all in one place. And so that's what we worked with these groups on. But at that time, that was before the pandemic. And we didn't have any interest in Congress regarding the cattle industry. They just weren't interested. We had one exception. We had Senator Cory Booker said, well, we're interested in knowing what you want done in the cattle industry. So that's how we put all of this in one place. Mm-hmm. The unfortunate situation is that Senator Booker also included language in the bill that contains our cattle competition reform package. Mm-hmm. He also includes some environmental and very radical environmental concerns in that bill that would reduce the size of confinement feeding operations in the United States. And we said there's no way we can support those provisions. That would be contradictory to the financial and economic interests of US cattle producers. Mm-hmm. And so we've been trying ever since January to either get a senator to amend that bill and strike the bad language, leaving us with what was good, or to find a senator that would be willing to extract the good marketplace reform section and include it as a standalone bill. And so we began work on that after January. But then, of course, we had the presidential impeachment process that lasted for a long time. And there was no interest in looking at cattle industry issues at that time. Right. And then after that was over, we actually had meetings scheduled with a number of Senate and House offices in DC that were going to occur in the latter part of March. And then the pandemic struck. And so those meetings were canceled. So we've been working quietly with various offices in the Senate and the House since that time via phone calls, conference calls, in order to try to build support to put that comprehensive package in front of America, in front of Congress, because that package will in fact correct the market ills that has caused our industry to arrive at where we're at today. Mm-hmm. And right now there's a huge amount of fear, huge amount of uncertainty. The cattle markets are broken. Consumers are paying high prices. Mm-hmm. We have slowdowns in the packing industry. We have producers who can't get a bid on their cattle. I mean, this is as serious as it gets. And if we don't correct it immediately, it's not going to get any better. We have to have immediate reforms. And then leading back to the WNAX cattle market crisis special report, that is now a clear recognition around the industry And it is time for the industry to do what needs to be done to prevent this from ever happening again in the United States.
Yeah.
And that means that we can't lowball. We have to know, set minimum standards that we know will be beneficial. And that's what we've been trying to do for many years.
So a couple things let's go back to, because let's just address the elephant in the room. Today, there was a report that had come out with a very famous analyst that I like, actually, but he's wrong on some of these points. And we've been getting beat up a little bit on social media today about Cory Booker. So let's talk about that first. There's a lot of cattlemen, you know, that don't care for Cory Booker. And our CAF's apolitical, we're not Republican, we're not Democrat, so we'll work with whoever wants to work with us. And I just want to point out that when Booker had asked, his staff had said, hey, Bill, what do you guys need? I remember that conference call. It was a meeting that you called pretty quickly. And that's when they threw the CAFO stuff in there. And our board was absolutely not. We're capitalists. We would never want to limit these feed yards. And Booker's group came back and said, are you sure? And it was back and forth. Absolutely not. You stood the line, just like you're standing the line on this cash negotiated trade. Let's talk about that, because that's what's in the hearts and minds of everybody the last 24 hours. Lots of messages on, Bill, why are you fighting the industry so hard on this 3014? Why? I've heard things like, you know what, if it's not your idea, you're just not going to settle for it. And let's talk about the fact that we were, as an industry, you're driven by the board, with the board at the pleasure of the board. In January, we were already working on this. The industry went into triage because of COVID-19. But talk about our position on a majority instead of that 30-14, and so maybe to alleviate some fears.
Yeah, so back in 2007, when Senator Grassley first introduced this bill, it was a phase-in process up to 25%. So when we began working on this last fall, we asked the question that we're faced with today is, what is the correct percentage? Well, we looked at our cattle cash market volume in 2015, 16, 17, 18, and 19, and we're averaging somewhere around 24%. And we know that that is way too low. And so we began talking to cattle feedlots, asking them, what do you think we need to do to correct this marketplace? And many of them came back with the 70, 75%. Some of them said, if you really want competition, pure competition, eliminate all captive supplies and you would just have a competitive cash market. So then we looked at other studies that have been done to determine at what level that market must be in order to be insulated from abuse of market power by consolidated packers. And that number was at 50%. So we decided 50% was a good starting point. And if somebody were to come with a higher percentage than that, we'd step back and likely support them if there is a possibility of getting that passed. But importantly, in the 50% level that we included, we recognized that we had the northern meat packers, many of them were already up around 40% or higher. And it was in the South that we had the small volumes of cash sales. And so we recognize, number one, these packers aren't going to overnight significantly increase their cash sales. And we also recognize that there's a difference in type and quality of cattle between North and South. So we wanted to make sure that we didn't have just a straight across the board percentage, because that could allow packers to shift where they're purchasing cattle from and actually flood the market with a type of cattle that are not consistent with what we have in the North. In other words, you could skew the cash market if you didn't make sure that you had equal volumes of different types of cattle and different quality cattle. And so we built in a phase-in period for 4 years for those packers who, at the time this bill was passed, had captive supply levels above 60%. We actually used 2018 as the baseline. And so this was a measured ability to immediately bring all the packers that weren't already using 60% of their cattle as cash or as captive supply cattle. we would bring even the northern states up. They had to be at least 50% in order to keep the volume and diversity in that marketplace sufficient in order to maintain a good price discovery market. So that was the rationale when we put that into the package that was introduced in Congress in January of 2020. And we've been talking to producers ever since, because that was our starting point. We wanted to start at 50% with a phase-in period, and perhaps we would, make refinements to that, make changes to that. But under the circumstances, we weren't able to do that because somebody came out with a much lower percentage that blew what we were trying to do out of the water. And so now, if you're in a negotiating position, you don't really want to start way low, below what you need to expect to eventually get what you need.
Right.
You should start at least at what you need. And we knew without question that we needed at least this amount.
Well, and actually, I know that you've said before, prior to the craziness of COVID-19, that these congressional offices were saying to you and our members, because you were doing a lot of meetings with these staffers, and they were saying, why would you not just go for majority? And so when people say, because here's what I'm saying on social media a lot, you'll never get it. You'll never get it. You're never going to get it. And I found it interesting today that on that WNAX the radio presentation, there was an analyst, and you probably would know the name, Dave Cumbia, maybe. But one of the things he said was, now's the time to be bold. If we're ever going to be bold, now's the time to be bold. And he's an NCBA analyst. And so isn't that prudent to, holy smokes, if you've ever bought a car or a horse or, whatever, you always negotiate coming down. You don't negotiate going up. And so, go ahead.
Well, importantly, we recognize that just raising the cash market to the 50% level that we're asking for is not going to solve the problems in our broken marketplace. That was just one step. And that's why in this comprehensive package, we included a ban on packer ownership and control of livestock. We included a ban on formula contracts that did not contain a base price. We addressed the other significant issues in our industry. For example, we knew that the USDA was not inclined to pass rules to implement the prohibition on undue preferences and advantages. The issue of whether packers large feedlots are receiving sweetheart deals. So we wrote that in. We clarified what an undue preference or advantage was. We also addressed the issue as to whether or not a producer has to prove harm to competition in order to seek protections under the Packers and Stockyards Act. And then we addressed many other issues that are very important to producers, such as when a packer will provide carcass data to one producer, but not provide that data to another. We included that as an unfair practice that was prohibited by the Packers and Stockyards Act. And in that bill, we include the restoration of mandatory country of origin labeling, not just for beef, but for beef and dairy products. And so this was a comprehensive reform package. And where you start with that is you start where you need. So we have included in there, we really didn't build in a buffer for negotiating positions, because the negotiations will occur on the floor of Congress and in the hearing rooms. And so we needed to be honest, straightforward, and responsible in recommending a reform package that will help us rebuild America. Now, importantly, under today's conditions, we may need a bigger correction, a bigger fix than even what our reform package represents at this point. In other words, the bottleneck that is now manifest in the marketplace, that is between the meat packer and the consumer, has become so severe that we're seeing shortages of beef in the beef counts or cases, and we're seeing producers who can't sell cattle. Now everyone in the entire United States of America knows that we have a dysfunctional system. So if Congress is going to make even bigger fixes, and many people have talked about those, the need to have more packing plants, not fewer, But if you have those kinds of brick and mortar structural changes, you will still need the reform package that we've included, because then you will ensure that whatever you rebuild that's broken in the industry, it will be rebuilt in a manner that facilitates robust competition so that producers can earn their profit from a competitive marketplace. So we didn't try to offer a level that was higher than what we need. We offered the level that we viewed to be the minimum. This is what is necessary in order to begin restoring competition to the market. And then we need to bring all of these others in. And you mentioned triage earlier. When the crisis hit, there was no way that we could overwhelm the offices with this entire list of reforms. And so we did triage. We identified the two issues that we need to bring to Congress and that we had the best opportunity to get their interest and their support. And that was restoration of mandatory country of origin labeling for beef and increase the cash market price to 50%.
And importantly, they're coming to us. They're coming to us saying, what do you need? How can we help you? How foolish of us to not absolutely say, here's what we need, because they're listening to us. Praise the Lord, right?
Well, yes, they're listening to us now because Congress knows that it will need to do something to correct this serious, serious problem, in addition to providing, the funding that they're looking at providing now. So we're really focused on what structural reforms do we need in the legal framework that defines how our markets function, that defines who has bargaining power in a negotiation between hundreds of thousands of disaggregated producers and just a handful of meat packers. So within that legal framework is where we have placed this requirement that the packers purchase at least 50%. And so the way this is going to play out is that the congressional offices that are keenly focused on this already have our proposals. They've had them for a long time. They're now beginning to receive other proposals. So they have a majority proposal in there, at least 50%, and now other at least 50% are coming in. But when they see this 30%, they're going to say, now, wait a minute. What is it that the industry needs? And we might get something in between there. If the entire industry had recognized the seriousness of this situation and recognized that Congress was now more willing than ever to finally do what needs to be done to correct our broken markets, if they had understood that, they would never have brought forward such a low price lowball figure. In fact, I hope they throw it in the garbage. I hope they dispense with it and join on with us to support the 50% level. And it's not just us anymore. As we just said, we've got the National Cattlemen's Beef Association that's not supported reforms in the past is now talking about a price or a volume at 50%. And so too is the Nebraska cattlemen. It's time for us to stand shoulder to shoulder with all of these groups, because there can be only one goal here. And that goal has to be to restore economic opportunities for our U.S. cattle producers. And we've got to fight for that.
We have to fight. And quite frankly, this is war, because there's a lot of people right now that are going to go out of business. Come fall, if we don't get this fixed, people are going out of business. And I was saying something the other day, probably this morning, it feels like it's been 5 days today. But, when that fear is a powerful motivator. And when people are afraid because nobody's put a bid in on their cattle for 3 weeks, they're willing to settle for anything. Right? People are afraid, and I get it. I mean, people are bleeding out. But what if we only get 30? What happens?
Well, so RCAF has been more aggressive than anyone else in preventing us from making 30 a benchmark, which is why we've shocked the industry. We purposely dug our heels in the ground, got very aggressive, very direct, because we understand what will happen if we lowball the industry and undercut our producers. And now, nobody knew whether or not there was any support for that position until today. Until now, we have other organizations that are viewed as being very conservative organizations are now saying, not necessarily the same thing, but they're now talking on the same level that RCAF is, that you better bring back 50% of that market if you want to hope to have a positive benefit to the industry.
Because 30% cash negotiated is 70% captive supply. Are we locking our kids into that? Because this may be the only shot we have in our lifetime, right? I mean, that's what people are saying. Not those aren't my words. And so, you know, can I just say that, because this is all over social media, how RCAF, we don't want to work with anybody. We don't want to link arms with anyone. And one of the reasons that I have appreciated working with you the last 4 years, and my family, we're ranchers, has appreciated you, is because even the hard thing, even though it's not the popular thing, you always, and our board stands for the right thing, right? And right now we've completely gotten beaten up today, except for that WNAX interview, which we'll post today. After this interview, we'll post those segments so people can hear how that conversation went. But we're not at all saying we're not willing to work with people. We're just willing to say we won't compromise. Is that right? That's what I hear you saying.
Well, there are some issues you can compromise on, but the issues that will infringe upon a producer's profitability, economic standing, ability to stay in business, liberties, freedoms, some things you can't compromise on. And so more than any other organization, RCAP takes risks, because we take risks based on the best information we have, and we do that on behalf of our membership. So this, of course, was a risk for RCAF to stand up and say, now, wait a minute, we've been pushing for a 50% level for a long time. And in the face of this lower recommendation of 30%, and suddenly the discussion turned around and said, well, you're only upset because it wasn't your idea. But the fact is we had 50% true. Here's what's true about that. We didn't come out with 30%. We came out with 50% for the same structural reform that this would create. So the 30% is not our idea. The 50% is. The concern we had was the 30% undercuts the 50% that we know is necessary in the industry. And now more and more within the industry are beginning to acknowledge and understand why the 50% level is necessary today. And maybe it wouldn't have been necessary 15 years ago, but the way our industry is structured today, we're hopeful that a 50% increase will bring about the first stage of a progressive series of benefits that we need to impart in order to restore competition.
Well, I appreciate you standing the line on this. And again, I just think it bears repeating, you know, we're going to do the right thing, even if it's not the popular thing. And I don't know why any producer, if there's, you know, when people say it's not possible, there's no way we'll get it. Well, we're having congressional staff say to us, why not the majority? And so, of course, we've been working on this for the last few months, but we hadn't come out with it publicly yet because COVID-19 happened, and it was one of those back burner issues until the immediate crisis was put away. So, you know, just a couple more questions. Here. You know, I want to read this. This is actually from a Texas producer. This was a question that came in from a Texas producer. Please explain the long-term effects of the 50 versus the 30. I think people really are in a bad situation. We need some help. And before we lose our livelihood, and ranchers are willing to grasp at any form of achievable help. We have to reach out with heartfelt help. Please explain the 50% versus 30% long-term.
Okay. Well, actually, we did that. And so the difference between a 50% and 30% long-term is the 30% is way too low to have a positive impact on the marketplace. And so the 50% is the minimal threshold we need. And, you know, we've never been where we're at today. So we've never had so much focus on what level should the cash market be. But we're beginning to see that, and it's growing every single day. We should take a breath while this is happening, because we're not going to get legislation passed in a week. We've got Senator Grassley indicated an interest to introduce legislation. We've got other senators who have said the same thing.
Mhm.
And so we need to continue working with those Senate offices. Producers in their respective states will be calling them and making recommendations. And our hope is that we keep this 50% level, at least at 50%, because again, that does not correct the fundamental dysfunction of the marketplace. It's a step in the right direction, but you have to do more, which is the other issues contained in our comprehensive. So you need to get that first step right, and you need to restore mandatory country of origin labeling for beef at the same time. We're asking that both of these be included immediately in order to provide that first necessary step to begin rebuilding our broken marketplace so producers can be competitive. So as the days progress, we firmly believe that more and more organizations will come forward with a clear recognition that as a minimum, we have to have at least 50% in the marketplace in order to have the semblance of a competitive market, at least there, and prevent the level of distortion that we're seeing presently.
We're close to MCOOL, aren't we? We're close to getting cool. Right now, more than ever, consumers are aware of the food supply, the breakdown in the food supply, the security of their food supply. We are at RCAF, we're seeing people come on. We're seeing a lot of consumer members come on. We're seeing producers sign up every day. We are close to, probably closer than we ever have before.
Well, we certainly are. And again, that stems from the fact that our nation has never been in the location where we're at today as a result of this pandemic, as a result of the economic downturn, as a result of the inability to have our food systems deliver food that consumers want in the grocery store. We've never been here. That means all of the old hesitancies that we may have had to offer what we believe was necessary should be thrown out the window. Today is the opportunity to be helpful to this nation in order to put in place those structural reforms that we absolutely need to restore profitability. And so country of origin labeling that has been dismissed out of hand in past years has suddenly grown to become one of those issues that is now being seriously considered as a first step in the process of achieving reform. So absolutely, we need to continue to push for mandatory country of origin labeling, because most producers out there understand just intuitively how important that is to be able to compete in their own domestic marketplace. And they know the only way they can do that is with the label.
Yeah, it's our trademark. I mean, many people are calving right now. They're staying up all night. They're pulling calves. They're having calves in their laundry rooms. I mean, we put our blood, sweat, and tears into these calves. I mean, our label is important. And for people to say that we'll never get it or it's not important, it's almost offensive to me as a producer. So 2 more questions, and then we'll let you off the hot seat. And I had just written this down. Today we had put up a press release on our Facebook page, and then we took it down. And one of the things we pride ourselves with is we don't censor comments unless you are vulgar, cussing. You know, there are some exceptions, threatening, but we don't censor comments. And so because we feel like dialogue is healthy. So why did you instruct staff to take that Facebook page down, or that Facebook post down today?
Well, it has to do with the governance structure of RCAF. The RCAF USA board directs the organization to fulfill the policy of the members, and they hire me to carry that out. And we operate in a way that on a day-to-day basis, we seek consensus. In other words, we don't come to a vote on every issue.
Mhm.
So if a board member objects to something, unless that something is very important, we don't touch it.
Mhm.
Or if a board member calls me and says, you know, you were kind of harsh in that email that was posted, or the alert that was posted on the website, would you take it down? And I, without question, immediately took it down because I respect the individual board members who's, you know, taking their voluntary time away from their own cattle operations in order to serve the interests of our 5,400 members. I respect them completely. And when they ask me to do something like they did today, I respond as quickly as possible. So that's what happened. We had a board member that was concerned. Perhaps others were. Perhaps others didn't agree, but that didn't matter because to the extent that it is possible, we operate on a consensus basis with the board. And that's why we're so nimble and able to aggressively take after these issues on a very timely basis. It's because we have adopted a streamlined, respectful decision-making process that does not encumber us under, you know, a bureaucratic type approach. So
Right.
that's one of the unique facets of RCAP.
Right. Well, I appreciate our board. Our board, they've met many times late into the night in the last few weeks, talking about all these issues, sometimes just within hours notice. And I appreciate you addressing the fact that RCAF just isn't Bill Bullard, because I think that is a misnomer that Bill Bullard is a one-man show, but it's not. We're just a bunch of grassroots producers doing the best we can. I had so many calls today with board members, and they're in their feed wagons, they're in the pasture checking cattle. I have to wait till they get service. I mean, RCAF is truly grassroots. And so I just want to encourage everyone, if you have signed up and you're a brand new RCAF member, thank you so much. You did not make a mistake. RCAF, we stand on the line for the producer. And one of the things you can be thankful for is you can always trust that Bill Bullard is Bill, you analyzed and overanalyzed that data. That wasn't a gut feeling, this cash negotiated trade and those points that you put in that package. You put a lot of time and effort, and you have the data. Numbers are powerful, right?
Well, and even more importantly, it was our membership that, you know, that supported these policies through the resolutions that they voted for and worked on at our annual conventions. Mm-hmm. And so what's extremely important for producers to know is that, you know, we very much appreciate the individual producers. And I'd like to take this time to apologize to the folks who I have not been able to call back yet. The phone lines have been extremely busy, and I'm way behind. So if you're on the phone and you haven't gotten a call back from me, hang tight, it's gonna happen. You know, and I'd really also like to apologize to anyone who I may have offended when I took such an aggressive stance against this effort to undercut the level that we've been pushing for. And the reason I took that was because our history in RCAP is that this isn't a new situation. This has happened to us before, and we've responded differently in the past. We've responded passively to some of these deceptive actions that have occurred that have actually caused harm to the organization. And so we don't do that anymore. And what we did is we fought back, and we fought back hard. And again, the purpose of that was to prevent a groundswell. There's a virtual frenzy out there joining onto this 30% idea or sign-on letter. And we needed to prevent a groundswell from occurring because we knew these other organizations that were giving a critical look at this issue were going to come out with a much higher percentage. And we wanted those organizations to be free to come up with the right percentage. And they're doing that. They're doing that at the 50%. So that's why RCAP was so aggressive. And my apology goes to those who I've offended for being so direct and aggressive on that matter. Mm-hmm. But that is what we must do if we're truly going to correct the fundamental problems that have been our industry for 20 years. And this is the opportunity to fix it. And we're not going to let anything stand in the way of our ability to restore for you an opportunity to earn a profit in this industry.
so here's my last question, and then we'll take a few questions. If you hear that dinging, that's people texting me some questions. So here's my last question. I think you have a persona that you're always data and facts and figures and stoic, and people tease around with you about your and we have to be able to laugh at this, right? Because we're not without humor at RCAF, Yosemite and your denim shirt and whatever, and I'm just like, whatever, if that's all they got. But a serious question, Bill, you've been the CEO of RCAF for 20 years. I asked you one time when I first started, Bill, when are you going to quit? And he goes, or retire. And you said, when we win. But why? Why do you fight so hard for 20 years? What is it that makes you, I need you to I need you to show your emotional side here a little bit. Why do you fight? Why have you fought for 20 years? Why have you not just given up? Because when people come after you, your character, they say awful things about you. Why are you still here?
Well, the short answer is because I represent the best people in the world, salt of the earth, honest, hard workers. But the other answer is, and when I give presentations, I talk about, the numbers of producers that we've lost within just half a lifetime. Back from 1980, we've lost 544,000 independent cattle producers from this industry. Mm-hmm. Well, I am among them. I'm a former rancher, had to leave the ranch back in the mid 80s as a direct result of a dysfunctional regulatory regime, dysfunctional marketplace. And unfortunately, many of my neighbors left before I did, people who had been there for much longer than I had. And so, I believe that this industry needed better representation and needed someone that was willing to withstand all of the criticisms and attacks that they would get in order to accomplish one thing. And that was to accomplish for independent producers the opportunity to have a competitive market in which to earn a competitive income. Mm-hmm. To operate in an environment that's not skewed against them. So that's why I do this, because I believe in it.
And you can identify probably more than anybody those people right now that they can't get their operating notes renewed, or, this is personal for you. So when people just think you're some CEO and some ivory tower and you're just disconnected and here for a paycheck, this is personal for you. And I appreciate that, because the reason I love my job so much and the reason my job's also so hard is because it's personal for me. And every one of these board members, a board member said to me today, and I think it's worth bearing, so worth repeating. So I'm going to say it. They said, people may make fun of Bill Bullard because he lost his ranch in the 80s, but what sort of man does it take? And you hate accolades, so this is just me going off script. What sort of man does it take to have lost in his personal life, his personal ranch, and yet loves an industry so much that he's willing to lay down his life for the rest of us? And so I just want to say thank you, because today's been a tough day. Yesterday was a tough day. But you know what? I appreciate the fact that you stand on the truth, not because it's the easy thing, but because it's the right thing. I want to take a few questions that I've gotten, because I know we probably only have a few minutes, and I appreciate you getting on the computer with me to address some of these things. This question comes from Arkansas. Can anyone answer what the cost to the producer per head for Cool, and what will Cool do to bring the producer price cut off? Let's answer that first one, the first part of it. Can anyone answer what the cost to the producers per head for Cool? Does Cool cost the producers more?
Yeah, so there isn't a cost to the producer. Even when country of origin labeling was fully implemented, all the producer had to do was fill out an affidavit and leave it at their local auction yard, or give it to the buyer of their calves that said that these calves were exclusively born and raised in the United States, or if they were foreign cattle, they had to stipulate that that was the case. So passing that piece of paper along was all the producer needed to do. There was no cost to the producer. So that's a misnomer. The industry says that there was a cost to the beef industry as a result of this. Well, yeah, there was. It's because they had a more difficult time bringing in these cheaper products, because now that they were differentiated, the producer had the ability to build demand for cattle that are exclusively born, raised, and slaughtered in the United States. And if you look at the economic interest of the producer versus the economic interest of the packer does not share the producer's interest to build demand for animals that are exclusively born, raised, and slaughtered in the United States. That's not among the things that the packers want to do. So we need to recognize that. So that's why they kick and scream so loud about the cost, is because with country of origin labeling, American producers can begin to increase demand for their American produced live animals, and the meat packers don't want that. And this gives the American producer the opportunity to compete in his or her own marketplace. So this is a huge fight. It's been going on since 2002. That was one of our first legislative wins in Congress. In an upset win, we passed mandatory country of origin labeling. Fortunately for the chicken producers and lamb producers and fish and shellfish and fruits and vegetables, all those farmers continue to benefit from country of origin labeling. We just need to continue fighting until we get ours back.
Yeah. You know, I'm scrolling through some of the questions here, and I've seen this a couple of times. There's some folks that are not happy, and they want to say, Bill Bullard, you just want to always divide the industry. You're just always wanting to divide the industry. Can you just address that?
Well, our intent is to represent our members' goals and aspirations, and we do that by fighting for policy. Mm-hmm. So we are an advocate for our membership, and in order to win policies, you necessarily have to go up against those who that don't agree with you. Mm-hmm. You have different positions. So if you think this is a big fight, wait till we get this issue introduced in Congress and brought to the floor. There's where the fight's going to begin, because then you're going to see the high dollar lobbyists running to Washington, beating on doors and trying to push your issues back. So we fight for the issues of our members. Mm-hmm. And that means from time to time, we will fight those within the industry that are working to counter the economic interests of our members. And this was an example. Yeah. Coming at this issue with a lowball value contradicted the interests of our memberships, so we fought back.
You know, politics is messy, isn't it? It's not fun, it's messy. You know, one of the things that I would say, and I have a little bit of a pause to go here, but I get so many calls about it. So we're going to talk about the MCOOL fight that we had our first win. And then of course, when it was repealed, the same association or organization, group of people that are wanting to bring the lower cash negotiated trade were also for MCOOL, but you were fighting with them in DC, right? I mean, you were on the Hill fighting with them, trying to get that passed in, and they switched right in the midstream. And so, it almost feels like that's similar to what's happening right now. Is it's not that we're not wanting to work with people to get this done. You just can't blow holes in the bottom of your boat. And so I'm just seeing some of that here on Facebook. Here is a question that just came through. Let's see. She says, as a producer who retains ownership through the feedlot phase under the 51%, can we still sell under the specialty market of non-hormone age verification and still ask for grid information? I don't think this 51% will affect us in any negative ways, but I realize I'm a small niche in this marketplace and wanted verification.
Right. So the 51% would be a requirement imposed on the packer. So 51% of the cattle they purchase each week, according to our proposal, would have to be purchased in the competitive cash market. And what needs to be clarified is what is considered cash, because I know some organizations view the cash market as being equivalent to the negotiated grid price, but the negotiated grid price continues to rely upon the cash market. So the program that you've described should not be impacted by this. Perhaps you're on a negotiated grid. Would you sell those animals? And even if you're not, the meat packer is probably able to source other cattle to reach the level of the cash market that they need. So I'm not sure how you sell those animals, but if you're already selling cash where you negotiate the price, then of course things would remain the same. And if you're on a negotiated grid, in some instances, those could be a negotiated base price, and then you just tie the rest of the premiums and discounts on the grid. So it doesn't appear to me, especially what we're contemplating for the type of a regulatory regime, that this would in any way adversely affect what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question. Why is your 50% not even on the books till 2022?
Oh, that's not correct, because the way that we wrote it was that immediately all the cash procurement sale floors must be raised to 50%, except for the packers that already have captive supply levels exceeding 60%. So for example, all of the packers in the northern states like Nebraska that averages in the low to mid 40s, all of those would have to go up to 50% immediately. But if a packer down in the Texas area, for example, procured say 90% of their cattle through captive supply formula contracts and only 10% from the cash market, they're the ones that would go from 10% to 20% initially, and then it would rise to 30%, and then it would rise to 50% by January 1 of 2024. So that's negotiable. That's a phase-in that we did to accomplish two objectives. Number one, to make it possible for packers to re-engineer themselves to immediately begin using the cash market. And the second one was what we talked about earlier, was to ensure that we didn't skew the types and volumes of cattle that comprise the cash market that will continue to set the base price of cattle that the futures market would be looking at, and that all of these other marketing arrangements would continue to be tied to.
Okay. All right, we're going to do two more questions and then we are going to go. Here's a question. How will and who will trace the cool you are backing? No people necessarily understand the fundamentals of how cool works at the packing plant.
Okay, so I think the question, if I understand it, is how will the beef from an animal be labeled unless there was some means of tracing from the animal from the farmer ranch to the packer gate? The way to do that is the way that was partially done when country of origin labeling was in place, and that is, it's a methodology called presumption of domestic origin. So because the United States requires all imported cattle to be permanently identified with a hot iron brand or other country's official ear tagging system, and it's unlawful to remove those markings, those animals carry their foreign origin with them throughout their life. So a packer can look at an animal visibly and visually, and if that animal bears a foreign marking, then it must have been born in a foreign country. And if the animal is walking and didn't arrive in a sealed truck, it must have been raised in Canada or Mexico and then partially in the United States. And then the packer knows where it's slaughtered. So the packer doesn't need any other information in order to label the foreign animal. Now, if an animal arrives at the packer gate and is a slick with respect to foreign markings, if there are no foreign markings, it can be none other than an animal born, raised, and slaughtered in the United States, because the country of origin labeling law only requires the country of origin, not any other specificity as to the farm or ranch or state or county or whatever. And then you have the production steps that can likewise be ascertained through the same methodology that is no cost to the producer.
Okay. we're getting several comments, people just hammering RCAF for working with Cory Booker. Let's talk about that. You know what? RCAF's apolitical. Me personally, not a huge fan of Booker, but by golly, I'm going to be thankful for any senator who wants to help the U.S. cattle person. So, you know, RCAF gets hammered about these. You work with HSU, you work with PETA, which are lies. Obviously, Booker's liberal, so it doesn't set well with a lot of our membership. You know, RCAF, we're not a bunch of liberals that are just going around. I mean, it's so crazy to me that people think that about RCAF. Address the Cory Booker issue and why we have worked with him in the past.
Well, you have 100 senators representing the entire nation. We've been to many of their doors asking them if they would listen to and consider the reforms that we need for the industry. And Senator Cory Booker is the one US senator who back in it was actually the early fall of 2019, who said, I'm interested in knowing what the cattle industry needs in order to restore its profitability. And so, as we talked about before, we will work with all the senators and all the members of Congress in order to achieve our members' policy. But we made it very clear to the senator from the outset that if he included things in that bill, we would not support it. And there was no compromise there. If they included something we couldn't support, that was the end of it. And unfortunately, that's what he did after he introduced this comprehensive bill. But that doesn't take away from the fact that the comprehensive reform package was put in there by cattle producers, poultry producers, hog producers, and dairy producers. And RCAF supports those. So that is our reform package. And what we're looking to do, as I said earlier, is take it out of that bill of Cory Booker's because he's not with us on the overall bill, and bring it to senators that are interested in the cattle industry. So that's where we're at.
And there's several that, again, before the COVID-19 crisis, that we were working with to do just that. And
we continue working with them now, even after the crisis. We're just doing it over the phone rather than visiting in their office.
Yeah. And there are several. And that's why when people say, can't be done, it can't be done, you'll never get it. It's crazy. I'm chuckling inside, but I'm thinking to myself, we're already having the conversations and they're already willing to do it. So stop saying we'll never get it.
They told us that in 2002 when we brought and won the farm bill, or in the farm bill, the mandatory country of origin labeling. They said that in 2008 when we included the requirement that the USDA was forced by Congress to write rules on the undue preferences and advantages. So we've heard that tired song before, but that doesn't deter us in any way for continuing to fight for what our members need.
You know, there's a remnant in that group that are saying, oh gosh, 30 is attainable. We got to go for 30. We got to panic and go for 30. But really, that's just an amendment that won't even happen until September. And people are in a frenzy saying, we got to do it now. We got to do it now. What is when people, because there's some messages on here saying we won't be in business next year. It's attainable. We've got to do it now. How do you respond to that?
Well, as we have already tonight, and that is there's a growing awareness that 30% is far too low, that we have to be at least 50%. We've got congressional members who have indicated an interest in supporting that kind of legislation. So we should start there at 50%, and we will have as good a possibility as you would at a lower level, but a far better opportunity to actually help independent producers.
And if you have to negotiate down, you have to negotiate down, but you don't start low. I mean, all right. So people are talking about these Texas cattle. They're feeling like maybe these Texas producers are getting the shaft here. If we start at that 50%, one person says, if you mandate negotiated trade on the Texas cattle that usually are formula cattle, then you increase the base price. We all work off of.
Please restate that question.
If you mandate negotiated trade on the Texas cattle that usually are formula cattle, then you increase the base price we all work off of.
And that's the intent, because the belief is that the base price, which is the price associated with the 5 area state weighted average price that that the meat packers, by having too low a volume in the cash market and too high a volume in the formulas, are able to distort that cash market downwards and lower the price, the base price for all the formula cattle. So what we believe is if you raised the cash level, that you would have more robust competition that would increase the weighted average price, at least it make it a competitive price, and that increased price would indeed be associated with the base price on those formulas. So that is the likely outcome of increasing the percentage in the cash market, if I understand that question correctly.
One person says 5 years of 30% and no MCOOL will gut us. That's a Kansas producer. I find it interesting, and I think we have to say it out loud. There's a remnant of those people that are wanting that 30% that don't want mandatory COOL. They say you'll never get it. You'll never get it. Well, right now, when people are freaking out because their meat counters are empty and they need food, and Congress is calling you saying, hey, Bill Bullard, what can we help you do? We can get MCOOL. We can ask for MCOOL, and we can ask for that 50%. And so I don't understand this faction of people, and God bless them. I mean, praise the Lord, they're getting involved, right? But for them to say you can't get COOL, and they're the same ones saying we have to settle. And, I guess we will go ahead and
let me address that, because we're fighting for 50%. We have more groups coming forward at 50%. The likelihood of getting 50% is greater today than ever before. The likelihood of going far beyond that particular reform to include country of origin labeling and the other reforms we talk about that likelihood is greater today than ever before. Now is the time to push forward. Those who say if we don't get it to 30%, we're going to be broke by next year. We hope to improve your situation by bringing it to 50% when this legislation is introduced. There's nothing slowing this legislation down at 50% today. When you have the other groups and you have senators who are already saying they're interested in introducing legislation, that's the best we've had for a long, long time. And at this point in time, not a one of them has said that 50% is too high.
Yep.
And that's why it's so vitally important that the industry move forward with its expertise and explain to those members of Congress why you need to set that floor at a level sufficient to actually bring about some improvements.
Yes.
And 50% is where the industry appears to be falling right now. And that's good.
So this is a good time to encourage people. If you're listening, many people every day, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? Two things. You need to right now get on your phones, call the Capitol Hill switchboard, ask to talk to your congressman or your senator. And if they're not available, get a hold of their staffer, their ag legislative assistant, ask for that, for them by that title, because that's who it is. It's going to be dealing with these issues. And a lot of them are social distancing. They're sheltering in place, working from home. And so they're taking calls. They're not on the Hill going to all of the different meetings on Capitol Hill. They're at home. They're waiting to hear from you. So now is the time. You need to call them. And here's the cool thing. I know you've been doing this, Bill, the last couple of weeks. Members have been calling you saying, hey, I have a meeting with my staffer. Can you get on this meeting? And so if you want to have Bill Bullard give some support while you are talking to your congressional aide or your congressman or senator directly, your time has been spent doing those meetings. Now is the time, y'all. I know for me personally, golly, it sometimes seems like I've called them. But now's the time to call them, text me, email Bill Bullard. He's the most accessible CEO in the industry. Again, I appreciate that about you, Bill, is that you'll talk to anybody. And you're very willing to help. So get on the phone with your congressmen, your senators. The other thing I want to talk about is MCOOL. Right now is the push We got to get to the consumers. And so we are getting ready to roll out this next week, a petition to get 100,000 signatures in 30 days. To the petition through the White House, they get that to Trump if you have that threshold. And so more than ever, we've got to get this pushed out to consumers. So be looking for that petition on the www.labelOurBeef.com website. Bill, do you have any closing remarks? I sure appreciate your time tonight.
No, I appreciate everyone that's watching this video. And again, let's stand together and get what needs to be done for our industry, and we can do that together.
Yes, we can, and we will. And we are thankful for the dialogue. We welcome this dialogue. Again, we're for the producers. We're standing tall. We won't compromise, even if it's hard. So Bill, thank you so much. And I don't know when we'll do another Facebook Live, but if it probably next week, I'm sure. I know that we were actually originally planning on doing something next week. So if you're listening, if you're watching, we have had an onslaught of new members, RCAF members. Welcome. Thank you. Thank you so much. As a producer myself, thank you so much for joining the fight, because when we go to DC, when Bill goes to DC, they ask him, how many voices, how many people do you represent, right? Because it's all about votes in DC. And so if you want to join RCAF, www.r-cafusa.com/membership. And as a side note, because I see this on our social media a lot, this isn't about taking your $50. This isn't about, oh, you just want membership. I tell you what this is about. This is about saving our legacies. That's what, at the end of the day, when you boil this all down, this is about saving the legacy of the U.S. cattle producer. Because if we don't do something now, we're not only going to be vertically integrated, but the independence of U.S. cattle producers is going to be gone. So now is the time. It is all hands on deck. We appreciate y'all. We appreciate the analysts. We appreciate everybody taking part in this conversation. Bill, thank you. Sorry about the technical difficulties earlier.
Good night, all.